Hey there! This is going to be my first impressions of the Canon R1 for shooting video. So this is not a review, just my first impressions. I also want to mention that this is not a loaner, this is my R1 and I bought this with my own money. Now I do use this camera almost strictly for wildlife video, so some of what I'll talk about will be specific about that, but I want to give you my general first impressions and thoughts about using the R1 for shooting video. In terms of image quality, I don't think there's any surprises here that the R1 produces a really fantastic and strong image. I did recently take a trip to the Galapagos Islands where I was able to capture some really cool creatures and some really nice images, and that's what you're looking at here. I love the colors and the details that come off of the 6K image, and it is oversampled up to 60 frames per second when you're shooting in 4K. The dynamic range is fantastic, and when you're shooting in C-Log 2, it's really easy to grade and you can get a really nice image out of it. I didn't notice any rolling shutter issues. Of course, this camera does have a really quick readout, and I unfortunately didn't really get to test it out in low light, although this camera is supposed to be pretty good in low light. I did even take this camera out to do some street video in Guayaquil, which is a city in Ecuador. I was using the Helios 44-2 and had a great time out shooting with that. So in a lot of ways, I think the Canon R1 does feel like a R3 Mark II to me. Now, around the announcement and release of the R1, I think there were a lot of criticisms about the R1 being an R3 Mark II or something like that. And this is not really a bad thing because the R3 is such a fantastic camera if you've ever used it before. So there's a couple things that got added in the R1 which I'm really excited about and I've really been enjoying. Now, the first of which is the pre-recording option. And so what you can do here is if you turn this on, you have the option of a 3 or 5 second pre-record. And what this does is it's constantly capturing an image. So when you press record, it actually starts recording that image to the memory card 3 or 5 seconds before you press the button. Now this is really handy when you're shooting wildlife, sports, any sort of action, because you can basically set up the shot and you don't have to be constantly recording to your memory card. Now this is great if you're shooting wildlife, if you're waiting for a bird to take off or you're waiting for like a bird to catch a fish or something like that. Basically you set everything up, you turn pre-capture on, and then when you see the action, you just wait a couple seconds in your head and then press record. Now the reason you do that is you don't want the camera to like shake, because the camera will shake when you press the button. So when you want to capture the recording, you want to wait a few seconds and then touch it. But this has been absolutely amazing for capturing wildlife. It is such a cool feature, and not having had it before, I don't want to go without it anymore. The next thing is the ability to capture C-Log 2 on this camera, and this does have the new custom picture files that is carried over from the Canon Cinema operating system, but the ability to shoot C-Log 2 is absolutely amazing. I know all of us have been asking for C-Log 2 in cameras like the R5C and the OG R5 and the R6 Mark II and all those cameras, but now that we have C-Log 2 in the R5 II and the R1, it really just allows you to capture the most amount of dynamic range. It's a great log curve. I love working in C-Log 2, and it's just gives you a really nice image and just captures a lot more dynamic range. In terms of autofocus, the Canon R1 has the latest and greatest autofocus that they offer. It also includes that new cross-type autofocus, which is only found in the R1. And one of the main reasons that I personally choose to use Canon for a lot of my wildlife video is the animal autofocus in video is exceptional. It is awesome. And it just works great. Now, I do still use manual focus a lot because I just personally use manual focus a lot. And there are a lot of times where you might want to use that. Now, if you're just capturing like birds in flight or quick moving things, use the full autofocus. It works absolutely amazingly well. A couple things I noticed when I was shooting certain birds or animals in certain situations, and depending how big they were in the frame and the depth of field, it would sometimes bounce between the head and the body or something like that. And just that little bit of movement, you could see that in the image. Now, what I was doing was customizing one of the buttons to toggle the servo autofocus on and off. And that way the camera would lock on focus. I'd press that button and then it would just be locked in. The other thing I could do is just hit the autofocus manual focus switch on my lens and then use focus peaking. And I do that sometimes still, even though this camera does have great autofocus, especially when there's a static shot or something like that where I want it to just lock and just not move. I do use manual focus a lot, but for action shots and quick moving things, I loved the autofocus on this camera. The next thing is the fact that this camera has dual CF Express Type B cards. And I'm not really sure of any other cameras that have dual CF Express B cards. Maybe there are some and I can't think of them. But I love CF Express B cards because They are more durable, they are much faster, and they're cheaper, per gigabyte, per terabyte than SD cards. And usually it's 1-in-1, but this has 2 CFB cards. I wish all cameras had this. I love CF Express B. In terms of the CF Express B cards that I use, I really like these pro grade cards. I will leave these linked down below. They worked great on the Canon R1. Next up is the EVF. And if you've ever seen the EVF on this camera, it is massive and it looks absolutely incredible. Looking through this is like no other, and I gave this camera to a few people just to try out, and they were blown away with how cool the EVF was. So really nice advantage of having a huge, really high-res, colorful EVF. A lot of times when you're out shooting wildlife, you are holding the camera up to your eye because it's really bright outside, or you just want a really clear image of what you're doing. This does have a great LCD screen on it and great colors and really accurate, and I really like the screens on the Canon cameras, but having a really big EVF is fantastic. Also, this camera has a full-size HDMI port, which I think we're all kind of excited to see as a videographer. Really nice to have a full-size HDMI. You can also record RAW in this camera internally, and you can do that up to 60 frames per second, which is really cool. Now, I did really enjoy my experience so far shooting with this camera, but there are a few cons that I want to talk about. Some of these are not specific to the R1, but some of them are. Let me talk about them. So I did mention how good the autofocus is, but if you come in here under the subject detection modes, you can see you have people, animals, vehicle, or none. Now, there is no auto option, and which is really weird because the auto option is in the R5 Mark II, which came out right around the time as the R1. The R50V, which is a $700 camera, and even going back to the R6 Mark II, which came out at the end of 2022, they all have an auto subject detection mode. I don't know why that's not in the R1. Next up is the fact that the R1 does not have waveform built in. Now, this has been added to recent cameras like the Canon R5 Mark II, but I cannot believe that in this camera, their flagship camera, there is no option. There's only the option for using a histogram. Pretty weird. Now, this camera does have false color, which is absolutely fantastic. I love having false color in cameras. It's really handy, especially for run and gun work. You can just toggle on and off, see if you're clipping their highlights or anything like that. Now, the issue with this camera, which is also the issue in the R5 Mark II and the R6 Mark II, is that you can't use false color when you either have the view assist turned on or if you have focus peaking turned on. Now, you can set a custom button on this camera to toggle false color on and off, which is great, but you can't do that for view assist. So you have to keep that in mind. You have to make some decisions here. Now, the other thing about peaking is I use focus peaking a lot when I'm doing manual focus. So if I use the manual focus, autofocus switch on the side of the lens, flip it over to manual, turn peaking on, adjust my focus, and then maybe I'm done with that and I flip the switch back to autofocus. Well, focus peaking is still technically on, even though it doesn't show on the camera, like the little red or green or blue or whatever you're using doesn't show up on the camera once you flip it to autofocus, but yet you still can't turn false color on because focus peaking is on, but it doesn't show up. So anyways, if you do that, make sure you turn false color off before you go back to autofocus. Otherwise, your false color won't work. The next thing is the view assist on this camera is really not accurate and is really causing me trouble. So let me show you an example of this outside. So to demonstrate what's going on with the view assist, here is a really basic shot on the R1, and what you're looking at here is the HDMI output being captured, but it'll be the same thing on the LCD screen or through the EVF, and I do have a variable ND filter on the front of the lens to get the exposure right. Taking a look at the image, you can definitely see all the information in the highlights if you look at the sky and on the road, and looking at the exposure based on the histogram on the upper right-hand part of the screen, you can see that I'm not clipping the highlights, right? The information is not all the way over on the right being bunched up and shooting up, so I am keeping the highlights intact. Also, if I turn the false color on, you can see that there is no red. Red would indicate clipping of highlights. There's a little bit of yellow in the sky there in a couple spots, but I'm not clipping the highlights here. So what I'm gonna do here is let me turn the view assist on. And I'm gonna turn it on over HDMI because that's what I'm recording here. And this is what it looks like with the view assist turned on. You can see that a lot of the information is gone or hard to see, but also if you look at the histogram, you can see that the exposure has not shifted, which is great, that the exposure is based on the log curve and not after the view assist, so it's good to see that. But I have a lot of trouble judging exposure with the view assist turned on. Of course, use your histogram and false color to get proper exposure, but just in terms of nailing the shot, getting focus, stuff like that, much easier to do with the view assist turned off. So here's the image that I just captured right out of camera. This is C-Log 2. You can see all the information, and this is after it's graded. You can see it was well exposed, everything's intact. Now, I've gotten used to not using the view assist while filming on this camera. It's not that big of a deal. The only thing I have trouble with is judging white balance, because the image is much less saturated and contrasty when you have the view assist turned off. So if I'm just shooting outside and it's sunny or cloudy, whatever, but if I'm shooting in interiors with mixed lighting or anything like that, I generally use the screen to help me decide on white balance when I'm doing that manually, and you just really can't do that when the view assist is turned off. All right, next up is a weird quirk that's also in the R5 II, and that's the fact when you go in and out of crop mode, it will take you out of 4K fine. So here I am in 4K fine, which is the oversampled 4K from the 6K. That's the mode you want to be in. It gives you the best image quality. So in the camera here, if we go and turn the movie cropping mode on, you can also do this in the Q menu. But if you enable this and you come in here, you can see that there is no fine mode anymore. So you have no control over fine or, oversampled mode or, a line skip mode. It just is what it is. But when you come back and you go out of movie cropping mode, it puts you in the non-fine mode, even though that's where I was before. And this caught me off guard several times before I figured this out. So if you're going into crop mode and you come out, make sure you put it back in fine mode. The only workaround I can think of for this is setting one of the custom modes, which I have set up here for like 4K 120, 4K 60, things like that. You could set one of those up for crop mode. The only problem is when you go into custom mode, all of the exposure settings are saved to whatever you saved in that custom mode. So if you have everything set up with a certain exposure and everything, and you just want to toggle crop mode on and off, well, those are the things you're gonna have to deal with. So that's kind of frustrating. So I do love the image quality in this camera, but the one complaint I have is the fact that the 4K 120 is not oversampled. So it only oversamples up to 4K 60. And I knew this before buying this camera, and I do think that the 4K 120 does look fantastic, but when you're staring at this really closely and getting nerdy about it, the 4K 24 and 4K 60 in the fine mode definitely look a little bit nicer. Most people are probably not gonna be able to tell the difference, but I just wanna point that out, that I'm noticing a little bit of a difference between the oversampled or the fine mode and the not fine mode. And in the camera here, when you're in the 4K fine mode and you come over to the frame rates, you can see that 120, you can't do that in the 4K fine mode. So in terms of overheating, I didn't do any specific dedicated overheat tests on this camera, and I haven't done any long form recording out in the heat with this camera either. I did get to use this camera for part of a wedding shoot, and I took it out for some B-roll and short clips. I didn't have any issues with overheating. It was really hot that day, but it was all short clips. For the ceremony, we used a couple of C70s and a C80. Those cameras are dedicated video cameras with fans, and they have no issue working out in the heat. So I didn't really get to push it that hard, but I did get this camera overheat while shooting wildlife, and the one situation it struggled in was 4K 120 with pre-capture turned on. And here in North Carolina in the summer, it was over 90 degrees Fahrenheit and extremely humid. And humidity makes a huge difference in the overheating of these cameras that don't have fans in them, or even some of the cameras that have fans in them now. And so that was the only issue that this camera had, was 4K 120 with pre-capture, which is kind of expected because the camera is constantly recording, to the internal memory while the pre-capture is going. It's just not recording to the card. But that's the only situation I had it overheat in, and everything else was totally fine. But again, I didn't do long form recordings on this camera in the heat. I always recommend that if you are using a camera in that way, that you need a reliable video camera, please get a camera that is designed for shooting video that has a fan and can handle the heat. Next up, I want to talk about the ergonomics and the user experience using this camera. Now, this is a bigger camera than maybe a lot of you are used to if you're shooting on R5s, R6s, R7s, anything like that. But I obviously knew that before I bought this camera, that it's a bigger camera, and it has its pros and cons. But the one amazing thing about using a camera that is this size, of course, is the fact that it has a really large battery that lasts quite a long time, a lot longer than like an R5 or R6 or anything like that. This is the battery that's in the R3 and the 1DX cameras, so uses the same battery. Now, the big grip on this camera is probably one of the nicest grips I've ever used. It is amazing. You can really grab onto it, and when you're using a big lens, like this is not a huge lens, but my Canon RF 100-500, when you have that on there, it gives you a lot of reassurance when you're holding the camera and a lot of accuracy with holding it, and it is really comfortable. In addition to that, This camera does have the vertical controls for shooting vertical. So when you're holding it like this, of course, you have a really nice grip on the camera and you do have all those controls, and you do have the ability to turn those controls on and off very quickly right here. So overall, like I said, build quality, ergonomics, this camera is awesome. The only thing I've had to get used to is of having a bigger camera, of course, is just lugging a bigger camera around, but putting it in a camera bag can be tricky because it is a lot taller. So you either have to take the camera and lens apart and put it in your bag, or you have to find specific bags that are tall enough to accommodate that. But once you get that sorted out and you've sort of committed to it, when you're out shooting, it's awesome to hold a big camera like this. So I know that I've owned, used, and reviewed a lot of Canon cameras on this channel, and I think a lot of you out there are probably wondering, Josh, how does the R1 stack up against some of the other cameras? Well, I want to give you some thoughts here. Again, this is not a review, this is a first impressions video, and I haven't done any side-by-side comparisons, and I don't plan on doing those videos at the time being, but I will give you some basic thoughts here in case you're just curious about how this stacks up with the R5 II, the C80, and the R3. So first off, let's talk about the R5 Mark II. There's a couple of obvious things. The R5 Mark II has a 45 megapixel 8K sensor, smaller body. It only shoots oversampled video up to 4K 30, whereas this is a 24 megapixel 6K sensor. It can shoot oversampled video up to 4K 60. This camera is going to do a lot better with heat than the R5 II. The R5 II definitely overheats, and you have to put the fan grip on it, and even so, you can get overheat in some basic modes. But again, I haven't tested this out in terms of stress testing the overheating, but in general, this camera will do a lot better with heat management than the R5 II in those oversampled modes. So in addition to that, when you're shooting RAW, I'd much prefer to shoot 6K versus an 8K, because 8K is going to be a much larger file size and a lot harder on the computer to edit. In general, I like a 6K sensor over an 8K sensor because there's just less things you have to deal with. You got a quicker readout speed, less heat generation with oversampling, and I think 6K is plenty for extra detail, sharpness, resolution, and the ability to crop and all those sorts of things. So in general, though, with their image quality, again, I haven't done a side-by-side, but I love the images out of both of those cameras. Next up, let's talk about the C80. The C80 is a dedicated video camera with built-in everything, right? You have NDs, you have XLR, it has the cinema operating system, which is really geared towards shooting video, and you don't have to worry about, is this thing on, is this thing off? You have all those different options and things like that in there. If you are looking for a camera that is a dedicated video camera, right, get a camera like the C80 over the R1. It has no overheating, and it's just designed to shoot video. So I haven't directly compared, like I keep saying, these cameras, the C80 with the R1, but they both have 6K sensors. They both shoot C-Log 2. I think the images will be more similar than they are different. The benefits of having an R1, though, over the C80 is you have weather sealing. This camera is much more, weather sealed and durable than the C80. You also have an EVF and the fact that you can take photos on this camera. So that's kind of the main differences I see. But in terms of images, they both produce great images and shoot in C-Log 2 and have 6K sensors. Next up is the R3, and I still think the R3 is a fantastic video camera, especially now that the prices come down quite a bit with it. The things you get on the R1 over the R3 is you get that pre-capture, which I talked about before, which is really handy. C-Log 2 is massive. If the R3 had C-Log 2, it would be a very different story, but that to me is a really big upgrade if you're shooting video on the R3 or the R1. You do get the full-size HDMI. You get that newer cross-type autofocus in the R1, although I'd be curious to see how those stacked up against each other. I think if you like the R3, you would love the R1. It's just like a better version of the R3, if that makes sense. So there will be more videos to come with footage from my Galapagos trip. I have posted one video, and I'll leave that link down below. I think I will do a review eventually on this camera, but it won't be my normal technical reviews. It'll be a more longer term review that's really based on user experience. So please don't expect a review in the near future with the R1. And as I said, I don't plan on making those comparison videos, but this is a very expensive camera, and I was lucky enough to pick it up before the price increase, and it was also on sale for a short period of time. If you are looking for a dedicated video camera, I would definitely push you towards, a C70 or C80 or something like that. But in terms of wildlife video, I really, really love this camera, and that's why I got it. So anyways, more stuff to come. Hopefully this was helpful for you. I know there's a lot of questions about the R1 for video because it is a very expensive camera and really isn't designed and marketed towards videographers. But anyway, I want to share my experience. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.